This is the end of 2024 update to the videos from earlier. All the content stands. Just wanted to do 2024 updated charts. So the first we're looking at is the unemployment rate. And you can see in the original presentation, which was recorded back in 2018, we hadn't experienced COVID yet. And so you can see there's a really sort of unusual pattern around unemployment in the COVID timeframe. So we had just an incredibly high spike in unemployment that was very, very transitory, right? I mean, way up near, it's not quite Great Depression levels, but very high spike in unemployment that almost immediately dropped back. You can see within, I guess that's probably about a year and a half, employment levels were back to where they were before, prior to COVID. And, and we're about, as low as they've ever been since 1970. And then now they're creeping up a little bit. And so, we know the unemployment rate can be an indicator of recession, but also, so the overall level of unemployment can change depending on how dynamic the economy is, right? If people are changing jobs more, that means structural unemployment is higher. But yeah, just you can see in the last, within probably 2 years, there's been a mild increase in the unemployment rate. So we'll see where that goes. Obviously, you look at the history of things, it tends to fluctuate. In the in the presentation, so I guess this is updated data on hourly wage growth. And right there was a bit of in 2018, at the time of the first recording of that information, there was it was a little bit perplexing that we had low unemployment and also low wage growth. And we saw that the COVID basically got that pattern unstuck, and we saw massive spikes in non-farm employees, and especially right for the for entry level jobs, there was a huge wage spike, and that wage growth has been persistent. So it was as high as 7% annually in the 2022 timeframe, and has since declined back down to 4% annual wage growth. But you can see, 4% annual wage growth is high relative to at least the last 20 years probably, right? So maybe in 2005 we had wage growth at that level. And so overall wage growth is much higher post COVID, and is in line with what it was 20 years ago. And again, that's I think not driven by, but a greater share of that wage growth is accruing to entry level work relative to working professionals with graduate degrees. So this also is an update of a chart. So this is looking at worker share of the corporate income. So this has been sort of a long-standing wondering that traditionally we would say that the workers would have, I guess if you look at overall income, it was sort of like 2/3 workers, and that this has been a decline. This is measured a little different way, but you can see that relative to the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s, that the overall share of corporate earnings accruing to the workers has declined. So it basically hovered around 80% up through 2000, and then post 2000 it's really closer to 75. There was kind of an exception during the Great Recession, but I don't think that's as much driven by wages commanding a bigger share again. Rather, just corporate earnings were smaller, right? And wages are sticky. So when corporations were struggling to earn money, they have a bunch of sticky wages, and so then naturally the the workers will command a higher share of the earnings because they're basically getting paid what they always got paid. There's just less earnings because of the recession overall. And then as the economy recovered, we immediately went back to the old share of workers' income share. So this is, economists aren't really sure why that is. It just seems to be a structural break in the share of workers' earnings. And if I was speculating, I would honestly, I'd want to dig into this more in the data, but I suspect that so much of the economic growth is, and especially all the stock market gains, so the stock market in particular is driven by just a handful of tech companies that were already huge and got even huger. And those tech companies tend to have, relative to their revenues, a small number of workers. They still hire a lot of people, but they make, their earnings are so large that the workers relative to earnings is much, much smaller. And so even though the salaries in those tech companies tend to be pretty good, the share of the overall income is going to be much lower relative to, like, a steel mill or big ag or something like that. Right. So that's my suspicion, but that's a guess. I don't have hard evidence to that effect. I think a lot of people would guess that, but you'd want to do some analysis to see if that's in fact driving it. And if that were true, right, it would be if we looked at the worker share of corporate income, excluding those, excluding tech, and see if it's still at 80. But my guess is probably that explains some of it, but not all of it. And then this last chart to update is the employment to population ratio. So this is, again, it's basically what percentage of your population is working. And we can see, there are especially countries that are demographically upside down, like Japan or China, where you have a lot of retirees and not a lot of workers. You get a low employment to population ratio. And you can see that this is also affecting the United States. Right, so you basically have, right, in the 50s, right through the 50s, you have, a lot of single wage earner households, right? And you can see, even through the 60s, right? So you can see through the 70s and 80s, we go from, a good chunk of single earner households to being basically multi-earner households being typical. And then, so through the 90s and 2000s, we have the two earner effect. And then post Great Recession, you could see the decline in the employment population ratio. And partly so this is, in 2010, you have people who lost work in the recession that weren't able to find it. And they, that slowly recovered over the next 10 years. And then we had the transitory spike for COVID. And now it's going lower, but you can see that this could be a consequence of it's a consequence of them having a right. I think people lost their health in COVID and had to retire early, or I think that relative to, obviously there were a lot of deaths in COVID too that would work. Right, employment population would go up, right, and that COVID was disproportionately dangerous for the elderly, but the overall effect appears to be a decrease in overall, just a slight decrease in employment as people have left the workforce. So yes, this is just updated data relative to the slides. The rest the rest of the charts, and the rest of that content is pretty evergreen. Yes, but you're looking over 100 years. It's not going to change much in 5, but yeah, thanks.